Hello, my quilting friends. Leah Day here, and today I'm joined by special guest Olaf from the movie Frozen. I found this panel at my local quilt shop, and I bought it because it's really a great opportunity to learn more about free motion quilting. We've got a lot of elements here that we can quilt basically just on the lines, along the outline, but then we've also got all the space in the background where we could add extra motifs, we could add snowflake designs, and then quilt around the whole thing, learning so much about how to move the quilt, what designs to use and where, and of course, stitch it up a notch to make it extra special and beautiful for the kids in our life. So I hope that you'll join me for this fun project as we learn how to quilt this Frozen panel. So the first thing I'm going to do when looking at this panel is I kind of start to look at the design and what I can do with it. And the first thing that kind of jumped out at me was Olaf himself. I really want to quilt him minimally, so I'm going to definitely quilt his outline and quilt around his eyes, and I'll probably go inside of his little carrot nose and actually fill this area with orange thread. So I'll quilt around it and then maybe do some arch shapes back and forth to fill that in completely. Same thing for his arms. I'm going to quilt around them and then just do some kind of softly curving lines. For his coal buttons, I think I'm going to quilt around them and then put a spiral on the inside. I think that'll really add to it. And then just generally quilt around his body, but leave the bulk of it kind of open and unquilted. So now let's talk about the background of this panel. We've got snowflakes, we've got the trees, and we've got some space to work in here and fill it with different designs. Quilting the outline of the snowflakes could be a little tedious and a little challenging because those are pretty complex shapes, but I'd really like to do that just to punch out those designs and make them stand out that much more on the quilt surface. I also might want to add even more. This is what everyone on Facebook is like, add more snowflakes. So I grabbed some snowflake stencils. I cut this with my AccuQuilt Go cutter, and I can easily use this to mark that shape all over the quilt. So we can definitely add more snowflakes anywhere we feel like we need them. So the very first step to quilting Olaf is to do the outline quilting basically around the major elements of his body. So around his mouth, around his eyes, the outline of his body itself. And so that's what I'm working on right now. And this is really just a matter of very careful stitching and speed control. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to have quilting gloves. It's just really, really help you grip the quilt and be able to move it smoothly and carefully under your needle. And that's how I'm able to quilt right on these marks and stay within the white area so I don't quilt outside the lines. And really, it's no big deal even if I did. Let's say I stitched off into the black area. Well, I could just pick up a black permanent magic marker and color my stitches, so it really wouldn't be the end of the world. So now I'm going to swing out and around, and I'm going to go around his eye. And as far as how much you decide to do outlining, it's really entirely up to you. I've used a wool batting within this quilt that allows stitches up to 8 inches. So in truth, I don't actually have to be quilting this densely. I don't have to do this stitching around his eye, but I just think it looks good. So it's really completely up to you how much stitching you put into any quilt. So now that I've filled around one eye, I've filled around his mouth, I'm going to fill around the second eye, finish up around his head, and finish outline quilting the base of his body as well. So I finished outlining Olaf's body, and then I ended up over here and I just filled in this tree with some back and forth wiggles, and that was just a quick, easy way to fill in that area. I don't particularly like those trees, but it filled it with a texture that I think really works. And now I'm out here on the border and I'm kind of working my way back up. And I want to hit some of these snowflakes that I have drawn onto the quilt, and I also want to start hitting the snowflakes that are printed onto the panel as well. So what I'm quilting in this border area, and I'm quilting across all 3 colors in the border with a design called Tangle of Lights. And basically what you do, it's a loopy line. So I'm going to stitch a loopy several loops and a lot of a wiggly line, and then go into a snowflake shape. That's a straight line, travel stitch back, then stitch a straight line perpendicular to the first, then stitch another straight line kind of right between those lines, and one more to create that beautiful star shape. Now you can use any of these lines to branch back out again, so I'm going to go travel stitch along that one and then return to my wiggly line, my wiggly loopy line. And with the loops, you want to just keep them, roughly about the same size and shape and moving in all different directions. I'm trying to keep my lines about a half of an inch or more apart, just so that the quilting doesn't become too dense. Really not necessary for the batting that I have or for the design itself. So I'm stitching another star here, star or snowflake, whatever you want to call it. And you want to just keep those moving, just about, every couple of times that you stitch a loop. Or if you look at your quilt, you stop and look at your quilt and you see that there hasn't been a snowflake stitched in a while, that should be a sign that you need to stitch another one. So I've got a snowflake here marked on the quilt, and this is just something that I added, an extra design that I added in. So I'm going to loop my way up here and show you how I'm stitching on those marked lines. There we go. And this is just careful stitching, the exact same style of stitching that we did with Olaf. My lines are a little faint, so I just have to be kind of careful, make sure that I know what I'm stitching on and I can see what I'm doing. One of the nice things about quilting something that you've marked on the quilt that is not printed on the panel is that even if you stitch it incorrectly, it doesn't matter. Those marks are going to wash out, they're going to be erased, and so no one will know that you meant to have that be a perfect circle. They're going to sit there and look at it and say, oh, well, it's stitched so nicely, I assume that's what you wanted. And so it's almost a get out of jail free card whenever you're stitching something like this. You don't have to worry about it being just exactly perfect. As you can see, I'm quilting this stippling basically straight up in a row. Now I'm going to wiggle it back and then kind of interlock it with the previous row, so just kind of wiggled out and then wiggled back in. And now I'm going to wiggle backwards, and I really can't see. I want to kind of get back in here in the area that I can't really see because it's behind my needle. So I'm going to move the quilt all the way around, rotate it around, and now I can see this angle so much better, and it wasn't a big deal to move it around to be able to see what I'm doing. And I always kind of squish the quilt and make sure it feels right. If I feel something kind of lumpy, bumpy under there, it might be that I've flipped the quilt underneath itself. I always want to pay attention to that. So I have actually gone on ahead and filled in the entire background, even going so far as to fill around the Olaf letters. And with this, all I did was stitch the outline of the letters, fill on the inside with more tangle of lights, making sure to hit any of my snowflakes, stitching them, and then also doing some echo quilting around them too. So the entire quilt is done pretty much. I'm just going back to the areas that I wanted to stitch in black thread. And the reason that I ended up quilting this way is because I had basically white thread threaded in the machine. I could quilt everything without thread breaks. I could hit all of these different motifs, keep wiggling around, connecting everything together. And it was inconvenient at that point to stop and change thread colors, change my bobbin, do all that stuff just to hit these things. And this was still stable enough that I felt like I could go on ahead and do that. It hasn't hurt the quilt at all. And it's good to understand with a project this small, you can kind of get away with that. We stabilize this area by outline quilting. Now I'm going back in and just adding these few little details. So what I've done, I've switched to black thread and I have outline quilted his entire hand. And now what I'm doing is simply filling that area with some back and forth wiggly lines. It's just very gently flowing lines. I think I'm going to take this one all the way down to his fingers. And when your thread matches with your fabric color, it's really close like this. You can really get away with a lot of mistakes, which is really, really nice. But it does make it a little bit more challenging just to be able to see what you're doing and where you're going. So if any time that you just can't see what you're doing, make sure to rotate the quilt around so that you can see better. So now I'm going to move to the buttons on Olaf's belly, and I'm going to stitch around the outside edge. And really the nice thing about this, you know, we've got this nice outline, and yes, you can try and get right on that outline, but really just kind of aiming to stay on the inside within this, you know, black-brown part of the button. It's really only looks messy if you jump into the area that you're not meant to go, into the white area. So just keep that in mind. Even if you have to bring your line of quilting in just a little bit to keep it accurate, that's fine. Okay, now I'm just going to swing around with a spiral. And this is the reason why I would leave something like this. This is detail quilting. It's not absolutely necessary for the quilt, but the reason I leave it to the end is it requires a lot of thread breaks, and that's a lot of starts and stops, and I just, personally, I find that a little distracting and a little slow. And so when I'm wanting to knock out a quilt quickly, I always focus on those things that I can do very quickly, don't require thread breaks or color changes, and that really speeds up the process. So looking at the quilt, I've got one more button to stitch and one more arm, and Olaf is going to be done. So here is my finished Olaf quilt. It really came out wonderfully, and it took about 4 hours to quilt. Now I will tell you a story. About halfway through it, I turned off my camera and I looked at it, I was like, I'm not really all that happy with it. I was kind of in this area over here. I really couldn't see the texture that I was creating on the quilt surface. It was kind of blotchy, and I was feeling really disappointed with it. But I decided, you know, it's going to be way too much time consuming to stop and rip this out. Let's just keep pushing, you know, push through it, keep going with it, and see what happens. So when I got up in here, that's when I started being able to see, you know, this nice wiggly texture that we were creating around the snowflakes on the inside, the wiggly tangle of lights texture that I was creating out here in the border. And it was okay that it wasn't perfect. It was okay that it didn't make absolute perfect sense, you know? It was a learning experience more than anything else, and it was really fun. It's challenging sometimes when you start getting bogged down with negativity. You know, start thinking, oh, it's not good enough, or I could have done that so much better. Why didn't I make a better decision? All that kind of stuff. You've just got to put all of that stuff away and don't let it stop you. Don't let it drag you down. I mean, it's kind of, all of that stuff is the opposite of Olaf anyway. I mean, he's happy and energetic and, I mean, completely naive. He does not know that summertime is going to kill him. So, you know, we need to be more like Olaf and just be willing and happy to embrace any new experience. And that's really what I take from this project more than anything else. I still need to finish the binding, but I cannot wait to give this cute little quilt to my niece. So I hope that you have enjoyed this process, seeing how I quilted it, and I really hope that you'll use this video to quilt your own Frozen Olaf panel too. Definitely subscribe to our videos so you don't miss out on any of the cool machine quilting videos coming out every week. And of course, if you like this video, share it with your friends. I'm sure many other people would love to learn how to quilt this panel too. Until next time, let's go quilt.